Okay, hello everyone. I just wanted to make sure that everything was working properly here. Hi, my name is Hector Acuna. I'm going live today to talk about an event that just wrapped up last week called Paint Cedarburg. And I'm very excited to recap the week and talk about the work that I created and just some of the process that went into making the paintings that were in the exhibition. And so without further ado, let's go ahead and just jump right in. I'm going to try to keep this fairly brief today. So let me make sure that I can see the chat just in case anybody has any comments or questions that they want to ask during the live stream. So we're starting off the presentation today to take a look at what went into making the 4 paintings that I created for Paint Cedarburg. This is a format of live streaming and documentation that I've really enjoyed from other artists like Charlie Hunter. He does a really great job of recapping his events, and I always appreciate the time that he puts into sharing his process, sharing, a very fresh look at his mindset from a week of painting, or work that went into a show that he has, and I'm kind of borrowing this format to try this out while my memory is still fresh. So first, the first slide I have here is kind of a spoiler alert image in case you're new to my work or you don't follow me on Instagram or other channels. I'm still kind of surprised and very honored that one of my paintings was awarded Best of Show for Paint Cedarburg this year. And so this image was snapped and shared on the Cedarburg Artist Guild website or Facebook page. And it is with the curator of the Cedarburg Art Museum, Nikki, and John, who is the executive director for the art museum. So let's go ahead and jump into things with the paintings. So hopefully this will work out well. I have a PDF file kind of pulled up for us here. So I wanted to show a little bit of the background of my panel making process. I made my own linen panels for the event and my own frames. These frames, which are pictured here on the right, are mostly made out of cherry hardwood, and I actually made these frames like 2 or 3 years ago and just had them sitting in my studio. I kind of forgot about them until like 2 weeks ago when I was starting to figure out what sizes I wanted to paint for the event. And originally I was thinking I'd go really small, like 6 by 8 inches to make work that was kind of really accessible and just wouldn't take a ton of time. That way I could prioritize work that I would be making for a show at the end of the year. However, I kind of thought about it and I found these frames and thought, maybe I'll go kind of in the middle size for my paintings this year. I've done small paintings, I've done large paintings for this event. So this year everything kind of hovered around 11 by 14 inches kind of as the average size. So I had one frame that was 10 inches by 8 inches. I had 2 that were 12 by 16, and I think I had two that were 11 by 14. Now with Paint Cedarburg, this event is pretty flexible in terms of how much they expect you to showcase, if anything at all. It's optional to show your paintings. It's a very big event. I guess I can give a little bit of context for this show in case you aren't familiar with Paint Cedarburg. But the event has been going on now for 25 years. This year was the 25th anniversary year, and it's a very open event, which means that you don't have to apply. It's an open registration. They have space for 165 artists to participate, and as far as I know, as far as I can tell, over the last 5 to 10 years, they've been able to fill all of those spots with artists who register for the event. Now, that doesn't mean that we have that many painters that come and do the event. Things come up and people are scheduling events for the year pretty far in advance. So because of that, the event isn't always full with that many artists who participate. But I'm going to apologize here for just a second. I just just want to make sure that I'm signed in to my YouTube channel. Let me just double check something. Sorry about this. Just in case the anything's happening in the chat of the streaming program, I want to make sure I can see if people are leaving things there. So sorry about this. Thought this would have already been set up. There's always something that happens. Okay, I think we're good to go. So anyway, the event has been going on now for 25 years, and for the actual exhibition, which is held at the Cedarburg Cultural Center downtown in Cedarburg, artists are able to submit 4 main event paintings, and then the judges who are hired to come in and judge the work pick award-winning paintings for different categories, and then there's a handful that are sort of just like the entire show. So anyway, I knew I had 4 slots that I could make paintings for, and because of that, I wanted to just focus on making 4 paintings. This has been an approach of mine that I've really believed in wholeheartedly over the last couple of years. It's something that I've been really pretty serious about with my work, and sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. But because I have this other show that I'll talk about at the end of the stream scheduled for the fall, I kind of felt like, you know what, I'm going to make work that if it doesn't find a collector during Paint Cedarburg, I'll hold on to it. Maybe this can be a piece that will go in the show later on in the year. So that gave me a lot of relief from my own process. But these were the panels that I created. So these are linen panels that, are made basically from those raw materials. So I cut out pieces of plywood. I use cabinet grade plywood, and I cut these to fit the sizes of these frames that I recently discovered in my studio. And then I take raw linen and I glue it down with a archival bookbinding glue. I believe the brand is Line Co. This is the glue that I use for making all of my panels. I've been using this for years and haven't had any problems. Sometimes with linen, I've noticed this more so with linen than with canvas, but I'll glue down and weigh down the linen with a piece of wood and a bunch of art books. Sometimes the following day, when I go to trim off the excess linen around the panel, I'll find little gaps on the edge of the panel with the linen. So you might have to go back and just double check and feed a little bit more glue in those gaps and then weigh it back down again. But that's the only issue I've had with gluing down linen. And then once that's dry, then I size it. I've been using both GAC 100 for a long time, which is what we see here in the image from Golden. And then once that's dry, I'll use an acrylic gesso. And depending on how much time I have before I have to make the paintings, sometimes after the gesso step, I'll do a layer of titanium oil ground, mostly from Williamsburg is the brand that I've been using and really like a lot. But for this event, I didn't have that much time to let the panels dry, so I foregoed the oil ground and I just painted on top of acrylic gesso that I eventually toned, which you'll see here in a second. And then here's a quick look at some of the frames. So this is the one black walnut frame that I had for a 12 by 16 inch panel. Here's the little 8 by 10 cherry frame. This is one of the other cherry frames. I think this is the 11 by 14. It doesn't really matter. They both look very similar in terms of the color and the wood grain. One thing I will mention, just like that was going through my head throughout the week, is that I was being very careful about what I wanted to paint, and especially in terms of the color palette of a painting, because I was thinking about the frame. And there's a benefit, I think, in my opinion, to using a very neutral color like white, black, for your frames, especially for plein air when you don't know what you're going to go and paint. At least in my case, one of the things I love about plein air events is that I stumble upon things that I choose to paint. Very rarely do I have kind of an idea of something I want to go and find, or a color palette that I know I want to use for the paintings. So because I was using these hardwood frames that have a very prominent wood grain, and especially the cherry frames are really beautiful. There's a lot of patterning and, just varying contrast on the wood grain, which you can kind of see just in the picture here. Some of this is the light sort of reflecting off of the grain, and some of it is just what the color of the wood looks like. But it can kind of get overwhelming, I think, and distracting, which definitely I think fed into what I chose to do for the paintings. So anyway, let's go ahead and move on to the first slide of painting. So what we're looking at here is kind of like day one. So the event starts on Saturday, and this is 2 Saturdays ago now, at the end of May. And we go to the art museum in town, and we get our panels and canvases stamped on the reverse side, and then we're sort of free to go out and paint. One thing about Paint Cedarburg is that they encourage artists to stay in the historic Cedarburg district, which is basically like the downtown area of Cedarburg. And the reason for that is because on Sunday, day 2 of the event, in the afternoon from, I think it's from 2 to 5 or 3 to 5, there is a public sale where all of the artists are invited, not required, but invited to come set up an easel, display their work that they've finished so far in the event. You can't bring past works for this. You can only show work that you just recently made. The title of that event during the week is called Fresh from Cedarburg. So it really fits the name that you're looking at these brand new paintings available to the public. And it's a pretty well supported event, I would say, on average. Artists of different levels have a really great chance to start to meet collectors in the area, and maybe even at times equally as important, you get to meet other artists that are in the event for the first time. So if it's your first time doing the event, I highly encourage that you make the time to go and set up your work, because it works as a great introduction to who you are and what your work is like. So anyway, let's zoom in here and take a look at some of these images that I brought in. So this is, again, on Saturday. This is day 1. I went into Cedarburg and found I was sort of walking around downtown on Washington Avenue. That's the main street in Cedarburg. Ended up over by one of the banks across from Brunch. It's a new breakfast restaurant in town. It kind of stands out. It's a very like contemporary looking restaurant. Everything else is very historic. But in the bank's parking lot across, not Main Street, but the other side street there, I kind of stumbled. I was walking around looking for just interesting things. I kind of had this idea of floral flowers in mind, but for a moment, there was a good 30-minute window when I was considering painting this little stump with these 3 pink flags. There's just something very satisfying about the proportions of shapes, the colors, the angles that the little poles sort of create in the landscape. However, I didn't really love the parking lot and the wood chips. That was the thing that really didn't draw my eye. I feel like if this was in a field, like a grass field, I would have probably painted this for some reason. Maybe not for Paint Cedarburg, but for another show. Across the street from this parking lot, though, was a little row of violet irises, which you can see in the upper right here. And there were probably 10 to 12 flowers on this iris plant, and they were beautiful, beautiful irises. There was another plant that had more blue and violet, colors on those flowers, but I really loved these deep kind of wine red, purple irises. So that's what I ended up painting, which you can see there. But all of those things were kind of in the same area. So what I ended up doing is, I've been trying to remind myself. I just recently taught a workshop a few weekends ago in Cedarburg that was all about plein air painting. And one of the things I really encourage students to consider doing is to make sketches and thumbnails and to walk around with the viewfinder and just give yourself options before you jump into a painting. I think anyone who paints, especially in plein air, can relate to this problem of having so much available to you in terms of visual information that it can be overwhelming. And you don't always know if you're picking the right subject. So making these quick 3 to 5 minute thumbnails, these are really tiny, like about this big, thumbnails in my sketchbook, my moleskin sketchbook that I travel with. And I kind of had this visual idea in my head of framing out part of the canvas. So I started with my smallest panel, my 8 by 10 panel, or in this case 10 by 8 inch panel. And this was the only one that I had made months ago. So this one had an oil ground surface, and it was toned. You can kind of see this strip on the right side with transparent red oxide, and I wiped off the excess paint. So it's a very thin, transparent layer of paint that I let dry before I started working on these paintings. But I had this visual of the iris flower, or one of them, sort of centered in my frame of the composition. And the first one on the top left, I sketched it in while looking at one of those flowers, because I just liked the angle of the shapes and the proportions. And then for these other three, the two on the right and then this one below it, I just walked away. I was looking at the little parking lot flag thing, but then I would just copy the same shapes from the sketch, and that sped up my thumbnail process. But the main thing I was thinking about was what to do in the background, right, with this like framed out negative space around my centered window. And I had a couple of ideas. It was kind of a wispy cloud morning, afternoon, so I was like, maybe if there's interesting clouds, that could be kind of a fun pattern to play with the iris shapes. So that's what this was sort of getting at a little bit. And then to the right of that, this is my little flag idea, and it was kind of a kitschy idea. I was thinking of like making those little flags out of the stump basically line up with the stem of the iris plant. I'm really glad I didn't do that. I think that would have been kind of cheesy. Not that that's a bad idea compositionally for future paintings, but I just feel like for that combination of like this very sort of like industrial functional image into this beautiful natural flower just didn't really feel like it would have worked out, so I'm glad I didn't go with that one. And then this one on the right was mostly just thinking about the orientation of the pattern of lines. Like, would it have been more interesting to have vertical paneling as opposed to horizontal? And in the background of my reference, you can kind of see it in the background of this image here, the walls paneling was horizontal. So to me, it's like I'm really thinking about the context of direction. Then the eye is naturally going to move horizontally back and forth, left and right, as opposed to vertically. But if I'm playing against that, maybe that would be interesting. So that was sort of what this little sketch was intended for, was to think about that relationship. And then this one on the bottom was kind of invented. Last year, I made a small painting. It was 6 by 8 inches downtown in Cedarburg, and it was like 4/5 this wall, this like limestone brick wall, and then this little narrow strip of the downtown street. It was one of my favorite paintings that I made last year, and so I'm very familiar with what the bricks kind of look like, because I stared at them for, I don't know, 4 hours or something that one day. But I was sort of envisioning maybe I could play with the brick pattern. That might be kind of satisfying, especially if it's a little bit bigger or similar in scale to the width of the planks of wood behind the flowers. So that was my last idea before I decided to just jump into the painting. Because eventually you have to start the painting and then use the painting to figure out what you want to do. So I started painting, and this was a photo that I snapped. I tried to be, I wasn't intending on doing kind of this like recap live stream after the event, but just for the sake of social media or a blog, that kind of stuff, I tried to take a couple of pictures of things in progress when I could. So this was pretty early on, maybe like an hour into the painting process, or 30 minutes. I think it was probably closer to 30 minutes. I was working really fast to just block things in. But I remember I had to wait like 45 minutes before I could start painting because those irises were in the shade. So there was this one little tree that was in front of the wall, and its shadow was slowly moving. And I was sort of following the pattern as I was sketching. I was like, I think this shadow is going to move. And I was like, I really hope it like pops these colors on this violet iris. Thank you, Maxie. Yeah, thanks for joining me today. I'm really excited to talk about the painting process. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put those in the chat. I'll keep an eye on that. But so that was one thing that I knew I had to be aware of, was that these flowers were going to eventually be in direct sunlight. And so I remember during that time is when I walked to the parking lot. I was working on the sketch of the other things, and I would kind of turn around and see if the shadow had moved yet. But eventually it did, and that's when I jumped over to that part of the street and started working on this painting. One of the things I think that also helped alleviate some of the pressure and the stress for me over the week was knowing that I had the 4 paintings to finish, but a lot of them were smaller than I normally paint in plein air. So that just like, it didn't feel as daunting to make this work. And starting out with this 8x10 panel also was like the perfect way to start my process for the week. So this was a really tiny little, section of the canvas, probably about, 5x7 inches or so, somewhere in that range, maybe 4x6, 4x5. And it really allowed me to narrow in on the character of detail in these flowers. So that was something that's kind of unusual for my plein air process. I don't typically get this detailed for the entire subject of something. If you're familiar with my work, sometimes it's like a small little vignette area that's more detailed to draw the eye. But with painting these flowers, I really wanted to convey their unique shapes and the lighting, condition on the petals of the flower. So it was really fun for me to work on these. Thankfully, it wasn't super windy while I worked on the start of this painting, but this is where I ended up after the first couple hours. I think I remember packing up like close to 4 o'clock, so I probably spent 3.5 to 4 hours on this painting the first day. So you can see how detailed I eventually got on the flowers. And when I took this photo at the end of that first session, the light had really moved, or there were clouds that kind of came out. And I lost a lot of that intensity that I had earlier on. Like you can see, this really satisfying shape of the shadow on some of those petals. The other thing that I was surprised to see eventually was how translucent some of the petals were and the glowing light that was inside of the petals. So like this little red triangle and this orange shape over here, both of those were colors that were kind of coming from the inside of the flower. So it was light that was hitting this very orange interior or very red interior and then kind of glowing through to the outside of the flower. Whereas these colors and shapes were all like light that was hitting the outside of the flower. So that was also really fun to try to capture the quality of those color properties. Again, this is what the flowers looked like. And, they were, some of them had already been shriveled up from the days prior. My wife and I have irises in our front yard. So I kind of was like, maybe if I don't find anything downtown, I can always paint some irises at home. And then this is the palette at the end of that first session. So just in case anyone is curious, I'll just run through my colors real quick. So down at the lower left, this is my medium that I use pretty much exclusively now for my painting process, both outdoors and indoors. This is Natural Pigments, or Rublev Colors, I think is the company who produces the medium. And it's called Oleo Gel, O-L-E-O, and then gel. It's a solvent-free medium. It's made with linseed oil, and I think like chalk dust or something like that to give it more of a body. I have 2 piles of titanium white. I have cadmium green, Hansa yellow light. Sometimes I interchange that with cadmium yellow lemon, but this is Hansa yellow light, cadmium yellow medium, Indian yellow, which is a color that I've really fallen in love with. I know a lot of plein air painters like this color as well. Yellow ochre, or gold ochre, I think is actually this pigment from Gamblin. Cadmium orange, burnt sienna, cadmium red light, alizarin permanent. This is a newer color for me, transparent red oxide, which is very similar to burnt sienna, but burnt sienna is opaque versus a transparent medium. You might be like, why do you have it next to the red as opposed to the burnt sienna? I think for the one convenient reason is that they're not sort of mixing together. It's nice to have them separated. Plus, I also have most of my earth tones over in the middle of my palette on the top. So it goes transparent red oxide, burnt umber, raw umber, and sometimes I'll put one of those colors out. Lately, I've been doing a lot of burnt umber, which has been fun. And then I have this upper right corner of just neutrals. 2 of these piles typically are store-bought piles from Gamblin. So I have Portland Warm Gray, which goes in this slot here. There's not currently paint there. And then Portland Cool Grays over here. And then I usually keep like 3 or 4 other little narrow strips for muted grays and neutral chromatic grays that come from scraping my palette. So like what we see on the palette here, I would scrape up into one color and then I'll push that down somewhere up here, because it might be a violet or a green or some kind of a blue that I would use to tone down another mixture And then after the grays, I have ultramarine blue here. I've got two blues that I hardly ever use, cobalt blue, so rarely do I actually put out paint in these slots, cerulean blue, and then phthalo blue. So I've got 4 slots for blues, but 99% of the time I always have ultramarine blue and then phthalo blue on my palette, which I know some artists are like, why do you use phthalo blue? Let me see, there's another comment here. What are the differences between opaque and transparent colors or translucent colors, like the two burnt siennas you just showed? When do you know you have to use one or the other? Thanks. So the biggest thing that I've recently, over the last year, started to pay more attention to is how an opaque color is going to mix with other colors, especially when you're tinting it up with titanium white. So when we brighten the value of a color, we're tinting it. And you can do that with white, you can do that with yellow. Any other pigment that's brighter than something else is going to raise its value. But when you use an opaque color, 90% of the time, in my experience, you're going to weaken the chroma of that color. So burnt sienna, when I add that with titanium white, the more titanium white that I bring into burnt sienna, the more pale that color becomes. But if I'm using a transparent pigment, because the pigment itself has the transparent qualities, it's not the oil or anything else, it's the pigment that makes it opaque or transparent. The transparent pigments like ultramarine blue, alizarin permanent, transparent red oxide, Indian yellow, when you add white to them, the chroma really explodes and it gets really, really high in terms of its vivid intensity of its color properties. So that's the reason why I've started to use more and more transparent pigments on my palette, because a lot of my earlier plein air paintings, I'm looking at them and going, wow, a lot of them are very chalky looking or pastel or pale in terms of the color intensity. So now it's like if I use a cadmium pigment, which is a very opaque pigment, a lot of times I'm not adding white to that pigment. I'm just keeping more of the purity of that pigment in that mixture so that its intensity can stay more chromatic. It just depends on what I'm painting, but I hope that answers the question, because that's a really good question. So then after phthalo blue, there's phthalo green that I keep on my palette. I really like both the phthalos a lot. And then Viridian's the last one that I've been using pretty frequently recently. There's other colors that I use. I've got a bunch of different paints, and every now and again I'll use one of them just, almost randomly, I guess you could say. But these are sort of like the staple colors on my palette these days. One last thing about phthalo. The reason why I'm a big believer in keeping phthalos on your palette is because, the thing that makes them their biggest challenge is also what makes them their biggest benefit. So a lot of artists will talk about phthalo being really hard to control and contain within your color mixtures. And I understand why people say that, because they take over. They have a very high tinting strength when you mix them with other colors and other mixtures on your palette. The key, I think, is to know how much phthalo to use depending on the effect that you're after. But if you're painting something that's very, very blue or very, very green and really chromatic, then it helps to have those really high tinting strength colors. That's the reason why I keep them on my palette. The other reason I like to have those colors is because they're just fun to work. Sometimes it's fun to work with something that's really hard to kind of wrangle or wrestle into place in terms of your mixtures. And the last main thing to keep in mind is it's about the relationship of a pigment to other pigments in your painting. So it's not like one color is going to have the same role in every painting that you make. Really, it's about the system of relationships that you are organizing in your painting to create a desired effect. So if you want an area to really stand out in terms of its blue hue, sometimes you might want a really intense blue to pop that relationship in your painting. So something to think about. Everyone can choose their own colors on their palette, but those are the reasons why I support those colors on my palette, and it can often feel controversial these days. Okay, so this is day 2 now. So that last slide was all Saturday, day 1. So Sunday, day 2, I had already agreed to do this live drawing, painting demonstration at one of the galleries that I'm in. This is the one that's in Milwaukee, in the 3rd Ward District and inside of the Marshall Building. So if you're familiar with Milwaukee, those names you maybe are familiar with, but if not, the Third Ward District is a sort of renovated warehouse district in Milwaukee that it's full of shops and restaurants and galleries. It's a really cool part of the city. There's a lot to do in the Third Ward, and there's one building in particular called the Marshall Building that's full of artist studios and galleries and small shops. And this gallery that I'm in is on the 4th floor of the building. And so when Kim, the owner of Kim Storage Gallery, invited me to do this new citywide event called the I think it's like the Sip and Stroll, event or something. And there were a bunch of participating galleries that signed up, and she was one of them. So Sunday was the second day of this weekend event, and I had agreed to come in and do this demonstration. So I brought a drawing to work on and to start and work on. A couple days before this weekend, I had started a new drawing here in Grafton, and so I was like, maybe a drawing would be fun to work on. It's a little bit bigger. Visitors can see more of what I'm working on. So I chose this view through her window of the gallery. She has this really beautiful outlook on the Third Ward. I think this is Water Street, if I'm not mistaken, in downtown Milwaukee. So this is the graphite and color pencil drawing that I made. It's kind of half of this large 20 by 30 inch sheet of paper that I was drawing on for like 3 or 4 hours in the gallery. So that was my kind of morning and afternoon on Sunday. So then after I finished up at the gallery, I came back up to Cedarburg and Grafton, and it was a gorgeous, gorgeous day. It was really comfortable outside. We got really lucky with the weather last week for the event, and I'm saying that in part because now, since last Saturday, it's gotten really hot and muggy in the area. So, and we've had a lot more rain the last couple days. So this is the weather that we had Sunday when I came back up from Milwaukee. So I got home, and I remember I was calling my wife on the phone on the way home, and I said something about painting flowers, and she was like, "Oh, did you paint the peonies that we have in the yard?" And I said, "Oh, I didn't know that we even had peonies." I forgot that she had planted some last year with her dad, and this video is going to get longer and longer, but there's so many like little stories I'm remembering now. So a year ago, Megan's parents were visiting us, and her and her dad, I must have been out of town for a workshop or something, but her and her dad were over at Home Depot, and her mom was probably with them too, but they were looking for different, plants for the yard, and one of them was a peony plant, and Home Depot either didn't have any or they weren't looking very healthy. There was something that didn't allow them to buy one from Home Depot, but there was a woman in the store who overheard them asking the employees about peonies, and she kind of sort of interrupted and said, "Hey, I have a ton of peonies in my yard. I live in Grafton. You're welcome to come over and just dig up 1 or 2 of these plants for free if you want." So Megan and her dad said, "Okay," and they followed her to her house. They dug up these roots and then planted them at our house. But this is the cool thing about this story. While they were at her house, the woman kind of, she lives out in the country. She shared all this little, backstory of her house that she lives in. Apparently, it's the house where Charles J. Guiteau grew up, and that's a name most people probably don't know, but he actually is the subject of a recent Netflix series called Death by Lightning. And the only reason I remember this is because I've been sharing this in some of the posts about this painting. But he was someone who got very interested in politics as he got older in his life, I think in like his mid to late 20s. And he became obsessed with President Garfield. I think that was the president at the time. And spoiler alert, gets really obsessed with him, ends up shooting the president, and becomes notorious for this, this event that happened in his life. So outside of that part of his life, nobody knows anything about this guy. But the weird thing is that this woman who we got the peonies from lives in the house that he grew up in, which is just crazy, how these things can connect and align. So anyway, these are flowers that came from that property. That doesn't mean that he grew up with these peonies. I'm positive that that wasn't the case, but it's interesting how things like that can connect. So anyway, I was working on these flowers in the afternoon. I kind of got them blocked in. I kind of piggybacked off of the first painting that I started and kept that same format of centering sort of like a portrait of a flower. And I've painted flowers on and off the last couple of years. It's not really like a series I've been working on, but for whatever reason this year I was like, I kind of like painting flowers. I think that would be really fun. So I tried to paint these peony flowers, and let me tell you, they are really, really hard to paint. I think even if you're painting them in a studio environment with controlled lighting, without wind, they're really, kind of diverse visual flower to paint because there's so many of these like little ripples and folds in the petals. But trying to paint these outside with changing sunlight, with a breeze that kept moving them around like this and like moving the petals, it was kind of a nightmare, to be honest. But because of that, it kind of created this really healthy challenge for me to focus on simplifying the form and really think about areas of the flower that I could group into larger shapes. And then on the offside of that process, I could find moments of detail or just really unique shapes that I could kind of zero in on and pull out as focal parts of the flower. So on the left is kind of like 30 or 45 minutes into the process, and then this is after like 2.5 hours or so. This is probably closer to like an hour and a half of process. But this is where I stopped after the first session. I'll zoom in just a little bit so you can get a better look at where it ended up. But the thing that I was really enjoying was the variety of edges. I don't typically play with edges of my shapes, especially not in the last 5 or so years in my paintings. If you're familiar with my work, you know that a lot of times it's very geometric and very like planar, with the forms, with sharp edges. But for this particular subject, because there was so much information and detail, I kind of had to just see the big shapes and then soften a lot of those edges. And that created the kind of like the backdrop or the context of the flower and what I wanted to do moving forward. So I kept this really soft edge on the left side through the duration of the process for the most part. You'll see later on, but this ended up being a 2-session painting in the afternoon. And this is on one of my 16 by 12 inch panels. And you can really see that transparent red oxide toned ground that I was working on. I'll just speak to that for a quick moment here. The reason I chose to go with more of an orange hue was because I could see the forecast for the week, and it was showing pretty sunny days consistently. And sometimes for events, if I know the weather is going to be really sunny and we're going to get blue skies, I'm thinking a little bit about like, okay, what's a color that's going to work well with blue or complement a blue sky? And so orange, pink, red, any sort of warm hue is going to create a really satisfying contrast of temperature and or of hue. So if you study color theory, especially people like Joseph Albers, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, who came out of the Bauhaus movement, he is known for research on color relativity and how perceptually we come to understand properties of color because of its surrounding context and or what's next to that color. So knowing some of that information, you can go into your painting process sort of curating the context for your color relationships, and it's a really fun way to also get rid of the white high value context of your panels. So I toned these prior to them getting stamped, which thankfully Cedarburg allows you to walk up with a toned blank panel. Some events I think are moving away from that, which is a real bummer. But all right, let's keep moving. So this is also this is now I think day 3. This is Monday. And so you get your stuff stamped. The first day you get stuff stamped is on Saturday, and then Sunday is the Fresh from Cedarburg. So you're painting in Cedarburg Saturday and Sunday, and then you can go anywhere in the county and paint wherever you want. Some artists, they skip Fresh from Cedarburg and they just paint anywhere they want starting on Saturday. You can do it either way. It just depends on what your priorities are. If you're trying to sell work, sometimes that Sunday fresh from Cedarburg can be worth attending, but you can only show work that is made in that smaller boundary. The full event boundary is the entire county. It might even be a combination of two different counties, actually. I think it's Ozaukee and Washington County, but for sure it's Ozaukee County. Anyway, you can go all the way up north to like Harrington Beach State Park. Yes, Interaction of Color is one of the books that I'm talking about with Joseph Albers. The other color theorist to check out is Johannes Itten. Johannes is the first name, and then Itten is the last name. Those are the two kind of like godfathers of color theory. And they're very technical texts, both of their books that they've published, but they're worth, at the very least, just kind of paging through. But if the other thing with Joseph Albers is he's kind of known for these like square in square in square in square, like screen printed compositions where he's really thinking about color. And a lot of museums carry his work nowadays or have his work in their collections. But I like also that square inside of a square or rectangle inside of a rectangle format. And that was the other thing I kind of borrowed from Joseph Albers this week. And it made it really easy for me to think about color theory. So this is a great slide to actually segue into, because I had established this violet hue in this small 8x10 painting. So I kind of was thinking, well, okay, maybe a complement, a yellow, some sort of a yellow could be a great, contrast to the violet in the painting. So I was looking kind of on the hunt for some sort of a yellow subject. And, in my little sketches, I was already thinking about brick walls. I was thinking about paneling. So I was mostly looking for walls. And I found this beautiful sort of marigold mustardy yellow wall right next to the pizza place downtown. One of the two pizza places, Sales, right downtown. And there's this beautiful little knot that was fallen out of a board on this otherwise very consistent wall. You can kind of see in this photo here. And that became the thing that allowed me to really figure out what section of the wall do I want to paint and where do I want to put that in the four corners of my composition. So, I really loved this little upside down U shape and this dark vertical line. Those two things being that close together, it made it really obvious where I wanted to focus my attention for this this morning session on the painting. So I spent like probably 3 hours painting in the wall behind my irises. And the hardest part for me was trying to get a believable sense of overlapping paneling. So it became a really unique challenge and subject to paint, where the light starts to kind of go into shadow just very gradually. Neither of these images are great images to show you close up what that looks like, but I didn't want this to look cartoonish, right? So I wanted to make sure it felt dimensional, that it felt physical, that it felt like there was some wood grain and texture and paint. So the longer I looked, the more I started to notice, and you can see when I started the painting here on my palette, I was looking at the wall and mixing up a couple of those mother colors, you could say, kind of the base colors of the palette for the wall. So there's sometimes it was a little bit more greenish, a little bit more murky and muddy looking. Other times it was a lot brighter, more of a condiment mustard yellow. So it was really fun just to practice mixing different yellows that I was observing. And that helped me keep the palette for the wall really harmonious and really continuous. So you can see here the knot both on the wall and in the painting and some of the little like cracks of detail. Again, if this week I got really into the details of my subject matter, which is kind of unusual for me. And when I teach, that's one of the things I really harp on students is like, don't paint the details, don't paint the details. So it's kind of hypocritical to some extent. But that being said, I think it really depends on the painting, right? It depends on what your painting needs and what you want to say with the work. And most of the time, if I'm being honest, it's like when I'm harping on this idea of like, don't paint the details, typically it's when we're painting a very vast, varied, diverse subject that's full of a lot of information. If you're doing more of a portrait of something, the details actually, I think, can kind of help give your painting specificity, character, a sense of realism, a sense of, place. And that was the thing that was really important for this painting, is that I wanted it to feel like this is one wall, this is one iris plant, that it was very, narrow and nuanced and specific. So that's where the detail became really essential for the painting. But that's where it ended up. And from there, then I packed up and I went back to, I don't have an image of it in this slide, but I went back to the irises one more time and just popped a couple of details and like tighter relationships, because it was believable to me. It felt colorful enough, it felt vibrant enough, but sometimes going back a second or a third time, it gives you that extra little bit of time to really look at the surface of your painting and to kind of think of it more as a painting and less of an image that references your subject. And I think that's something that kind of gets lost sometimes during events, because we're being like encouraged to go with our work, that especially during like a quick paint, you don't have the time to really think about the surface and the texture of the paint and that kind of stuff. So when you have multiple days and the weather is similar enough in terms of the lighting, go back. It'll give you that extra bit of time to ask different questions that you didn't have time to think about the first time in your session. So I took the painting back because it was just a few blocks away, reset up my easel, remixed some of the colors, started tightening up some of those details and surface qualities. And I'm really happy with how it turned out. And I can show you those details later on. But then that evening, this is Monday night, came back home, spent a second session on the peony flower. So again, this is the actual sort of plant where you can see some of those flowers. This is the one that I was painting. Now, photo to painting, it's not going to look very similar because my angle was slightly turned from the over-the-shoulder view that my wife had taking the photo. But at least you can see some of the local color properties and the intensity of light that was reflecting off of the flower. This was in the afternoon, so by this point the sun was starting to kind of move towards the horizon, to like the left of the image that we're looking at here. So the sun was sort of setting on that side and then raking across the landscape diagonally. So it created a really beautiful sense of volume and contrast on the flower itself. And because this is a very white and almost like yellow, purpley sort of combination of colors, but everything is very off-white, the petals of the flower that were in shadow had this beautiful violet hue and really subtle sense of contrast that was really fun to try and paint. But everything else on the left side of the flower was like blown out with its intensity of values. So this is how the painting on the flower turned out in the end. It's not the greatest lighting on the painting, so I apologize for that. But you can kind of get a sense of those areas that I went back in the second time and started to kind of carve out. I ended up painting over some of those smaller shapes and details that I had established, because everything had kind of changed when I came back the second day. And as frustrating as that is, it's also part of painting in plein air. When you're painting something that's very organic and natural, like one flower, it's not going to look exactly the same, but going into the process, accepting that is going to make it a lot more enjoyable, I think, because you're not expecting it to look the same, right? You're going to pick and pull. And this is how I view most of my plein air paintings nowadays, is that they're sort of like Frankenstein paintings made up of multiple observed moments, all sort of pieced together and stacked together. But by the end of the process, when I think, okay, the painting is finished, I'm looking at the entire painting still, right? I'm thinking about, well, does it make sense overall? Does it feel like things are clashing? Do things feel out of scale? Or does it not make sense in an awkward way, or in a way that I don't like? Sometimes you like the relationship feeling a little bit off and wonky, or kind of eerie at times. So again, I think everything is dependent on the painting you're looking at that time. So this painting I was really happy with where it ended up here. My favorite part became the top sort of rounded section here, where I got really crispy shapes on these very thin petals. That was the thing I think I really was like excited about the second day, was trying to convey the thinness of the flower, because they're so delicate. They're really dense visually, but they're so delicate and fragile. I don't Personally, for me, I don't think I captured the middle of the flower as well as I feel like I could. Um, Given the circumstances, I think it turned out okay, and I'm happy with it overall. But that's a thing where it's like, okay, next time, what would I want to do differently, or what could I, you know, uh, improve upon, or what are things that maybe I didn't think about this time that maybe would be interesting in a second or third painting. So yeah, so I finished the painting at that point, and then I had this big open area in the background that I was unsure what would become of that part of the painting. But this was Monday, and then oops, I actually have a slide. Oh, actually, no, that's in the right spot. So this was at the end of Monday night. And one of the things that was unique for me this year for Paint Cedarburg was that I got to spend a lot of time with my friend Nathan Brandner. He's an artist from Green Bay. He and I met briefly, but originally in Stevens Point when we were both art students up there. We overlapped, I think, for 2 years. And then he graduated 2 years ahead of me. And we both were on different paths for probably 7 or 8 years or so, and then reconnected actually at this event 5 years ago when my wife and I moved to this area. And he was one of the people that kind of encouraged and invited, educated me on the plein air world. Paint Cedarburg was my first interaction with competitive plein air painting exhibitions and opportunities, and he was the first person that was like, you should look at other events in the state. So I owe a lot to Nathan, but he stayed with us this year during the week, and we got to spend a lot of time catching up and talking about painting. It was really, really great. It was one of my favorite things that happened during the week. So then Monday evening, he and I were hanging out and eating dinner and catching up and stuff. So then Tuesday, I woke up. I had Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday left. Actually, no, really Tuesday and Wednesday left to work on paintings. And I still had 2 canvases that hadn't even been started yet. So I was kind of feeling a little bit of pressure, mostly because you never know how long a painting is going to take to make. But I had an idea. This is where I was like, sometimes I have ideas for what I want to go out and paint and what I'm looking for. So last year for this same event, I made this painting up in Port Washington that was called, crap, I can't remember the name of it now. It's something with an plein air stream, reflections on a plein air stream, or now I'm bummed that I can't remember the name of it. But anyway, it was a painting that received an honorable mention award last year. It's pretty big. I think it's like 22 or 20 inches square. It's actually now in the collection of my really good friend, Mark Anderson. Shout out to Mark Anderson, really amazing painter. Anyway, so that's kind of a cool thing about this, little side note about this painting. But it was a really fun painting to make because I'm staring at this convex form of this Airstream. It's this little ice cream shop, and the environment is being sort of bowed and flexed and mirrored kind of like this. And I was like, I kind of want to paint something like that again this year, but not an Airstream. I want to find like maybe a convex mirror like you would find in a parking lot. So I was on the hunt for literally like 2.5, 3 hours. Thank you, Max, for the reminder. Melting on a plein Airstream. Thank you. That's the title of this painting. And so I was driving around the county, like Grafton and Cedarburg mostly, trying to find one of these mirrors, and I spotted 2 of them. One was, both were in Cedarburg, kind of across the street from each other in downtown Cedarburg, at the post office, and then at the bank across the street. The problem with both of those mirrors, even though they were really cool, like they were half domes, like they were perfectly round like this, and the problem was that they were in really inconvenient locations for whoever would be needing that space. So if I set up there, I would be in everyone's way. So I had to just scrap the idea. And as I kind of came to grips with, the fact that idea was probably not going to happen, it was like, I think like 10 a.m. at this point, because I got up early and left the house at like 8:30 or 9, drove around. By like 11 o'clock or so, I ended up over kind of by the high school in Cedarburg, and I passed this little antique shop looking building full of these weird knickknacks in the windows. And I had never noticed this building before, but quickly was like, there's some cool stuff that I can look at in these windows. And it was like, by this point, it was really sunny. It was starting to get really hot. This is on Tuesday. Originally, I liked the front face of the wall with these 3 windows full of these cool things, but it was super sunny and hot. I was like, I probably should play it smart and just paint in the shade. So originally, I had my 12 by 16 canvas. I had 2 of those. My second one here, I set it up looking at this window on the shadow side of these 2 ceramic crocks that I thought were really interesting. I liked the way the sky was kind of reflecting off of this one, and just that really volumetric cylinder form I thought would be fun to paint. The problem with this view was that it was a very shallow depth of space. So there were big shapes and there was not a lot to kind of play with in terms of depth or variety of proportions. But I was like, I'm in the shade. It's the right thing to do. It'll work out. I painted for, I think, like an hour on this painting before I realized that it was just not going well, mostly because light was bouncing off of the street and then up onto my panel. And it was really hard for me to gauge all of the color properties, the values, and just everything was just very slick and reflective, even if I moved back and forth. Sometimes you can kind of get away with like seeing your painting at a different angle to gauge your colors more accurately. Even doing that, it was like I couldn't see anything. So I had to scrape it all off and wipe off this little rectangle that I had already sort of established. And I just was like, you know what? I like what's in these other windows. I'm just going to move over to that part of the building and just deal with the sun. I had sunscreen. I was like, I'll survive. But these were my thumbnails that I made of the windows. And I was kind of just thinking more about like, do I do a portrait painting? Do I do a landscape orientation painting? This was my little sketch I made for the 2 crocks in the window. And these were some of the other windows that I was looking at. Basically on this side of the building, there were these 3 windows that shared one big frame. And I debated for a long time which window I wanted to paint. But this one on the far right was the one that became my subject for the painting. And you can kind of see where the painting is almost fully roughed in for this little rectangle. One thing that I don't really have an image of, I was trying to see if I had pictures still, but I don't have an image of the shadow that was over the window. When I got to the building and I first got there, there was a shadow, big cast shadow from the frame on the glass. And it came out to about like somewhere over here. It was a big dark shadow, kind of like you can see up here. But and you can see where the frame itself is in shadow on the right side. And eventually over the morning, that shadow moved and was out of the window entirely because the sun was sort of moving like this direction. So the light was sort of moving like this across the window. And when I first set my easel up over there, the shadow was more like by this second lamp over here. So I quickly like put in that line and the little overhang line underneath the putty under the part of the window there. And that helped me kind of like keep that in my composition, because otherwise if you're painting and you're chasing the light, as we say, that shadow would move. And eventually it's like the whole window's in light. And that wasn't really what excited me when I first saw the window when I pulled over on this street. So I'm glad that that was something that like I was able to sort of just put in right away. But because that shadow moved really quickly, I didn't have time to see what the forms inside of the space were doing in the shadow. And I sort of just decided, okay, I'm going to keep the shadow shape really simple and just really soft and basic and just pull less attention to that part of the painting, which I'm really happy that that kind of happened. It wasn't all intentional. It just sort of happened that way. But this was where I was almost done blocking it in. And again, I'm like trying to take pictures as I'm working every now and again just to document the process. But that was where I probably was like 2 hours into the process at that point. And you can see I have my umbrella just protecting the painting so my values aren't all skewed. And the umbrella is reflected here as this big kind of almost like octagon kind of shape. And I'm really glad that that was part of the view, because it created an interesting sort of like doubling effect between the shape of the tree that's reflected and the umbrella. But the longer I looked, the more I got like kind of pulled and lured into the reflections on this little kerosene lamp on the windowsill. And then this is the palette after that first session. So you can see sort of like, let me zoom in a little bit here. You can see what my colors looked like. And the reason I show images like this, especially if I'm teaching, is because a painting can look and feel very vibrant, but most of the time those colors are actually fairly neutral or muted. And when you see the mixtures right next to pure chromatic color right out of the tube, you can really see how muted that range of color is. And this painting in particular had a lot of very subtle, like by grays in the palette, in the window. Like there were just a lot of cool gray, sort of violet colors. But by the end of the process, the painting looked kind of like this. And I was really happy with how it was going. Let me zoom or scroll down just a hair. I was really happy with how it turned out. It was really fun to try to convey almost like a still life, right? I mean, I'm not pretending that this is like a big, vast landscape painting. It's definitely more of a still life painting. But what was so fun for me to make the painting was thinking about light coming into the room, or the light that was on the glass, and then eventually on the frame of the building. And there's just all this light sort of bouncing around, both inside and outside. And that was the thing that really kept my interest and attention throughout the whole process of making the painting. But this is after a couple of hours of painting. And then I had this bold idea where I was like, okay, I'm going to try this thing where I'm going to just fill in the background with a fairly solid color, but take a color that I'm seeing somewhere in the building. So I was looking at this wood grain pattern. It was kind of like this grayish, warm, kind of off brown color. And this is the color I tried to put on. You can see it's fairly thick paint. It's pretty impasto, and there's a lot of grain and just like chunks of dried paint in this, and dust and just a bunch of crap in the paint, which I liked, for the sake of texture. But pretty quickly, by the end of this same day, I realized I don't actually like this color and what it's doing for the painting. And this is full sunlight, like my umbrella's gone, but full sunlight, you can really see what's on the surface of my canvas. And I just was like, I feel like it totally kills the contrast of what's happening in the window. So I ended up scraping all this paint off when I got home. All this brown paint got scraped off, and it ended up changing the orange transparent red oxide color overnight. Like it used to be really orange, kind of like this over here, and it kind of dulled that down, which kind of worked out actually, as we'll talk about here shortly. So this is what the panel looked like after I scraped it off on this top left. You can see it's kind of got this like dusty sort of feeling and look, because I tried to wipe away as close to the edge of this window frame part of the painting as possible to try not to disturb that part of my painting. And then I just let it dry. And I also had, what was I going to say? I also installed it into the frame of the painting at this point too. Because I've learned over the years, if you're working in floater frames, if you pre-frame your paintings, you're avoiding the possibility of putting your thumb right into wet paint to try to like install or screw in through the back of the frame into the stretcher or like the cradle of your panel. Because I've done that a lot over the years. So I've learned it's better just to have things already in the frame. It also speeds up time at the end of the week when you're stressed out trying to think of titles and get things turned in on time. So just a little tip, if you're working with floaters, I would encourage that you pre-frame them. And then if you're like, well, what do I do about the frame so I don't get paint on them? What I do sometimes is I'll wrap plastic wrap around them, like for shipping, and then I'll put tape in between the float, like in that gap between the canvas and the frame. And that really protects the frame from, paint getting anywhere. And it allows me to still work pretty like loose and expressive if that's something I want to do in the painting. So this is where those three paintings were at Tuesday, like late afternoon. I came home. I was super like fried and like dehydrated and hungry. So I sat for like 2.5 hours at home, just tried to like drink a bunch of water, sit in the shade, eat a snack. And then I still had that fourth panel that I hadn't started yet. So I went back out and I just was like, I'm going to go somewhere like Cedarburg and Grafton again. I stayed in those two towns, which is super local for the event. I've painted all the way up in like Belgium and Harrington Beach, Port Washington. I've driven out all the way to like, what's the name of that one park? I can't think of the name now, but like Fredonia area. Like I've done this event now, I think 4 times. And in past years, I've spent a lot of time driving, looking for things. This year, I also was like, I'm just going to stay in the area and just try to find something that I want to paint. And thankfully, it worked out. But so this was in Grafton, and I was walking around downtown. I think I had driven for like an hour in Cedarburg. I went through Grafton, came back to Grafton, parked my car on Wisconsin Avenue, which is sort of like the little main street that goes through Grafton. And that's this street down here. This is the Grafton Hotel that we can see through this little alleyway. Parked my car on that street, walked around the block, saw this view from behind some of these buildings, and I'm like, wow, this is kind of a nice little, sort of framed view of the hotel. And I really liked, this is at the end of the painting session, so the light is really flat. But when I got there, this white wall on the right side was like glowing. It was reflecting all of this like late afternoon light, early evening light still. And it cast this really satisfying shadow down along the sidewalk or this pathway between the buildings. So there's this really deep contrast of value. And I really like the shapes and the proportions of the shapes and this little window that's sort of like floating on this very bright wall kind of as a focal point. So I knew pretty quickly, I'm like, I think this would be a fun, just like natural composition to work with. The problem I had though was like what to do about my theme of like cropping into my panels and my canvases. So initially what I tried to do, let me zoom out, this is a terrible picture, but what I tried to do was this very narrow, you can kind of see there's a faint difference of a line right here. That was the top part of a very long skinny rectangle of a view cropped into this alleyway. So it went from this left line that's you can still see, this bottom dark line here, and then it came over a couple of inches and overlapped the white wall up along this rectangle. So I started blocking in everything there, and then as the sun started to set, this shadow crept up the wall, and there's this really gorgeous temperature contrast of cool and warm intensities on this white wall with this really strong kind of like sweeping diagonal shape that I thought, I think that I might need to put that in the painting. So I decided to kind of scale things out from that middle rectangle, mostly because I liked what was happening on the right side. So this painting was a very intuitive compositional painting. I didn't do a thumbnail. I really kind of didn't have time because I got to this at like 6:30 and started painting, and by 7 is when I saw that, like 7:15. So maybe I got there at like 6, but I remember it was like 7 o'clock because I checked my watch to be like, okay, I'm gonna come back. I need to know what time the sun, like the shadow starts to hit the wall, and that was around 7 o'clock. So, and I worked until about 8:15 before I packed up and went home for dinner with Megan and Nathan. Megan, by the way, my wife, was a just rock star for both me and Nathan. Last week, she was willing and generous enough with her time to make enough dinner for the two of us as well. Even though like we'd get home later and she would already eat. She was just my rock and was awesome last week. So I owe a lot to her just for the sake of time and energy that she helped with last week. So then this is on Wednesday. This is like the morning of Wednesday, the last full day of the event before we have to turn things in Thursday morning. So this is what I brought back to the location with the window. This is what it looked like when I started. And I knew I wanted to kind of put more time into some of the details in the objects. Most of it was painted though in that first session, which is kind of unusual for me. But it wasn't as sunny. It was kind of like on and off Wednesday morning with clouds, cutting out some of that intensity of the light that we had on Tuesday. But I decided to go with a lighter color. I'm like, maybe it needs a lighter color for this frame on the canvas. So I was looking at other things in the wall, and there's this kind of weathered white, very grainy textured paneling on the wall. And that sort of became my inspiration for what to fill in as like a texture, or as like a, almost like in like Photoshop where you could like fill a layer. That's kind of how I approached this part of my painting. And for me, that was a really fun aspect of the week. It's like I was collecting these different textures and surfaces and colors and patterns, and thinking more in terms of design and what to combine with a very painted view of something. Thank you, Max, for your comment. I really appreciate that. Yeah, it was fun with the shadow to think about like this trompe-l'oeil effect of like, you know, how does the space like either come forward or recess into the canvas? And to me, I saw this as like a box, like it's sort of this flat surface that's like this, got this box cut out into it, and we're looking into this box, kind of like you're saying as well. And then so the texture for this background here, let me zoom in for us a little bit. Actually, it was made with a brush. Like I just used, this is all, everything is with oil paint on these linen panels. So there's a nice texture and tooth from the gesso. And, you know, for me, like texture is such an, I think all of us would agree, but texture is one of the things I think is most influential when you look at a painting, because it's always going to relate or correlate with whatever is being depicted, especially if it's a representational painting. But the gesso, after I put like 3 layers of artist grade, like pretty thick gesso, I start the first 2 layers, it's kind of watered down. So it's a little bit more of like a cream consistency. But then the last 2 was like more heavy bodied gesso. Once it's dry, then I use a little bit of water and I lightly sand down any rough ridges and peaks on the surface. But then I get this really beautiful, rough, kind of grainy texture. And so because of that, I took a pile of this like kind of cooler off-white color that I mixed when I was like looking up at the wall. And I took a brush. It was a synthetic like flat brush that has a really nice soft kind of springiness to it. And it allows me to really just like grace the surface of my canvas with not much pressure. Like I'm not pushing down and pushing into the weave. I'm just dragging the brush across the surface. And what ends up happening is you end up with these like broken marks and brush strokes where you can see through the paint, and that like orange, or as we saw, kind of like dusty orange colors, like showing through the white paint. So that was how I got the texture, and I just kept overlapping it like in different directions. And I was really conscientious not to like blend it, right? Because once you fill it in, you lose that like noisy grain and abstract kind of toothy texture of the canvas. So that was like, it was a really fun way to end the painting and to kind of close out this painting. The other thing that was really fun, I guess what I should say, I should back up a second. The thing that kind of tipped me off to thinking of putting the white down in that way was that's how I approached this thin windowsill part of the window frame. So I'm zoomed in, I think, all the way now. Nope, I can go once more. So when we look closely, the window, the reference, had this like kind of bluish gray paint that also had been worn and weathered from light and weather and rain and all that stuff. And I wanted to convey that like kind of rough texture of the wood grain without painting every little detail that I could see. So I tried that idea first on this long, thin rectangle of the windowsill. The other thing I should mention that was really fun to paint, like, and kind of tighten up this second session, was the kind of like chunky, broken, like caulk that was along the window. So there's this really organic, kind of rough, thick, white, line that followed the inside of the window frame, but there were sections where it had chipped or broken off and you would just see the glass. So for me, that was one of my favorite parts about making this painting, was trying to convey that like dusty window kind of character and texture. And I don't have a great, this is kind of a good picture actually back here. You can kind of see what I'm talking about. Like this is where a big chunk of that white seal for the window had fallen off. But the glass, there was like either residue from the caulk or there was dust behind the glass, but it had this like cool kind of like diffused sense of transparency that had this really interesting soft edge. So the second session then allowed me to really go in and find these nuances of form and color and texture and try to give it a little bit more character and specificity. I think those are two of the words that really were like on the tip of my process and brain throughout the week, was like, how do I make it feel like this is the vase that I'm looking at, or this is the roll of tape that I'm looking at in this window. And the other thing I'll mention too that was really fun and kind of new for me was like trying to convey this like dusty, glowing light through the glass, or reflecting off of the glass, especially where there were these like transparent objects or reflective objects in the window, like this little glass jar with this weird like little stand that it was attached to. The back of it had this cool little spiral shape and form. That was one of my favorite things to put in the painting as well. But in the reflection here is I mentioned the umbrella, which is this big shape, but this is also my umbrella that was reflected. So my little reflection is somewhere in here as I'm working on the painting, but you have the sky and then the like sidewalk reflected on the bottom. A lot of people had commented during the show like, oh wow, it really looks like real metal or chrome or whatever. And I was like, it was fun. It was a lot of fun to just really closely observe the colors in those shapes and try to match things as close as possible. And then I installed the painting on these two random nails that were sticking out of the wall, because I thought it'd be kind of fun, just like an install shot of the painting, so you can see side by side the window next to the painting itself. But you can see how much the light moves, like more of the inside of the frame is starting to be illuminated throughout the day. The last thing I'll mention about this painting right now is that the owner of the building, his name is Dale. I'd never met him before, but he came out and he chatted with me both the days that I was there. And on the second day, he was with someone who was just assisting him, kind of like a hospice sort of nurse or something. And I can't remember her name now. I feel bad. I can't remember her name. But the two of them came over and they were like, wow, your painting looks so good. I really like your painting. And then he's like, I got something for you. And they went back to his house. 20 minutes later, he came back out and he's like, here, I want to give you this. And he handed me this little label, this paper label, because he told me some history about the building. So originally this building was built as one of two kind of like shop warehouses for this soda company called Ritter's Soda, and it was the soda factory. So people that have lived in Cedarburg for generations and families are familiar with this soda factory called Ritter's. And they would I think by train or by car or something, they would bring in this spring water that would be filled into these tanks that he said are below the building. There's like these big reservoir tanks for spring water that they would then use to make the soda. And so when he bought the house in this extra building, it was still full of this like memorabilia and ephemeral objects that were just left behind. On his porch, he has this really cool cooler that says Ritter Soda on it, but he had all these labels and he gave me two of them. And I was like, whoa, this is so cool. I'm going to put it I was like, I'm just going to stick it on the back of the painting. So this picture is, you can see the wire after the painting was framed, part of my signature, where this is taped and it's going to be forever attached with the painting. I thought that was kind of a fun little detail that I don't typically get to include in my paintings. But he told me some really cool stories about, the history in the building. And so these antiques were his antiques from when he used to own an antique shop in town. And then he moved them all to this sort of storage facility. And he was super generous and was like, you want to come inside? You want to look around in there? And you can, I can show you the inside. And I was like, I really want to, but I just don't have time. Like I was really stressed at that point in the day. I think I had also been standing out in the sun for a long time, but Dale was super nice. And at some point I got to stop by his house and tell him about how the event went and everything. So this is Wednesday. After that, I finished up the window painting. I was really, really happy. I'm like, this is my favorite painting by far from the week, was the window painting. And so I was just in a really, satisfied and excited mood. I think when things are going well, it's just like you're just really inspired by your own process and excited to see what else you can discover or uncover in your process. But the last painting then that I was going to, or not the last, but the next painting that I went to work on was my peony painting. I mentioned earlier I didn't have anything established for the background of the painting. And the longer I looked at it, like at home, I'm like looking at my paintings and
just imagine like what could I do or what would be interesting just to save me some time when I start to go drive around. So one of the things I kind of thought was like maybe some kind of a pink or red to go to kind of contrast the green in this painting could be interesting. So I'm like, maybe I'll find some kind of a red wall or something in that vein. And in downtown Cedarburg, kind of by the library, was there's this roastery. It's the Cedarburg Coffee Roastery, or it's something like that. And it's right by Fiddleheads, like they're side by side. But on the back side of the roastery is this kind of like barn-looking structure. It's this red, very weathered red color. So it's faded from the light. It's also faded from rain and snow. And it's got this beautiful salmon pink red hue. And I'm like, that would be a fun, wall to include. So just like every other painting that I made that week, I was backlit again. And so the back of my neck, it's starting to even out a little bit, but by Thursday morning, I had this dark tan line on my neck because I painted with the sun behind me every single moment that I was painting. I was backlit, but I had my umbrella to again protect the painting, and you can kind of see the difference here. It's like this is the image taken with the painting in shade from my umbrella, and on the right this is without an umbrella, so you can see how bright and intense and reflective the painting looks. And I didn't move the easel, so you're just seeing with direct light versus sunlight. And the reason why this is something I wanted to talk about quickly today is because when you're painting in plein air, you're always making choices based on what you see in the work, right? So because of that, if you're looking at your painting through really intense direct sunlight, 9 times out of 10, when you go to exhibit your painting, you're not going to exhibit your painting in direct sunlight. So the viewers aren't going to see your painting with what you saw when you made the work. And it took me multiple experiences and not thinking about it that way to realize how important this is when you set up your easel. So make sure that if you're going to paint and you're standing in direct sunlight, that you have sunscreen, you're hydrated, and that your painting is not in direct sunlight, because the contrasts are going to be really, really hard to control and discern if it's reflecting a bunch of light off the surface. And the worst part about this is that when you go to exhibit your painting, because look at how intense and just like high contrast that looks. And I didn't change my settings on my phone. It's like the same settings in both of these images. If the painting, was this intense in shade, it would be like, imagine how saturated and bright and vivid it would look with direct sunlight, right? So I hope that makes sense, because what happens is if you don't paint in the shade and you really love your painting with direct sunlight, when you bring it inside, usually it looks very dull, and like the contrast is gone, the saturation level is gone, because it only looks that good if this much light is hitting your painting. So that's why you want to make sure that you're moving away from from direct sunlight when you're painting. But back to the actual process here. So what I was looking at was, again, kind of like the yellow paneling wall, a small section of this salmon colored wall. I really liked this little knot of wood. You can kind of see over here, and then this line. Basically, it was this line and this knot of wood and this little vertical kind of texture below it. That's all I took from the wall outside of like the general color that I observed. You can kind of see this is what I ended up doing with the knot. Originally, I painted it where it was like black, like that little hole in the wall was like really dark, and it felt weird and out of place for the painting. It looked kind of like a belly button in a weird way, which to be honest, I kind of liked that it looked like a belly button, but for the sake of a plein air painting, I was like, I don't think that's really what the painting needs. So I sort of this is where I took a palette knife and I kind of just roughed up the shapes and the surface, and then I really liked it because it seemed more organic and just natural looking. The last detail that I put in was this little bolt head on the right side. You can kind of see it over here. Whoops, let me scroll down just a little bit. I really liked trying to convey the light that was reflecting off of the middle, like Phillips head part of the bolts. You can also see it over on this painting a little bit better, actually. That was one of my favorite details to put in, and the shapes and contrasts and details of the nail heads in the wall that were like, what's the word? Like impressed into the wood. Like they were pretty deep in the wood, so you could see where the wood kind of like angled in towards the nail head or angled back out. Like that's what this little tiny dark shape is. It's the wood. It's like a little chunk of wood that's sort of sticking out of the wall like that. That was really fun to try to get those basic contrasts in there, but I only spent one session on that part of the painting on the wall, and you know, if this was a painting I was making for a different show, I probably would go back and work on it a couple more times just to get more of the texture. But honestly, it worked out, I think, in the best possible way because the focus is on the flower, right? That's the main part of this painting, and the rest of it is just sort of like a frame or a context or half of a relationship that you can start to think about, like this flower is sort of in this wall or the wall is sort of protecting the flower. That's what I really started to like about the way that I was interpreting these paintings, where there were sort of like paintings within paintings. It's sort of what is containing this view and how does that relate to whatever we see in the smaller view. So flowers, they're just inherently delicate. They only last for a very small window of time. So there was this really nice sense of extreme metaphor that I could think about and imagine, like contrast then. It's like, okay, if I put a concrete wall, or if I put this weathered wooden paneling, like how does that relate to something that's going to be gone in a couple days? You know, there's an interesting sense of time and history and character, but just between the subject matter, between those two different things. And this is where I feel like myself as an artist and as a painter right now, I'm really, really like just really grateful to be excited and satisfied and kind of pulled by the process right now. Like I don't feel like I'm trying to jam ideas into my process. This way of working has allowed me to sort of stumble into concepts and ideas and metaphors and possible combinations of things. And it's just, for me, it's very gratifying to be in a place like that. So this is where those three paintings kind of ended up after Wednesday, before I went back and worked on the fourth painting again in Grafton. But you can see where things are sort of starting to kind of play off of each other. I really like the variety of color palettes between these paintings, but that these three in particular all share that same compositional format of the frame, sort of negative space in those compositions. So it was fun to have them all together on a white wall. This is like our little sunroom area. This is where I take most of my photos for my paintings because it's one of the few well-lit white walls that we have in our house. But it was kind of fun to just put them on existing nails that were on the wall. And it just looks like a great promo shot for a website or something. And then this is the last slide for the fourth painting. Again, back in Grafton. This time I was like, I want to get a picture of the shadow on the wall, because you never know. Sometimes with plein air, people are like, what did you see? What did it look like? Or is that really what it looked like? I've had questions like that before, and it sort of feels like you're put on the defensive sometimes, which is kind of, I don't know, it's kind of childish for me to even talk about that stuff. But I was like, this is such a cool shape and contrast. I want to share that with people. So I remembered to snap a photo while it was happening. And in the second session, the thing that I was really excited about and wanted to share in the work was what the inside of the shadow looked like. So I was starting to focus on like, well, how does this white wall shift in its value from the sunlight to the shadow? And if you just focus on like this little relationship right here, it's a dramatic difference of value and obviously of like chroma and temperature, from bright warm to like a middle value neutral basically. And I knew I wanted to keep most of this as like a big solid shape, this sort of purpley violet shadow shape, to help center and ground the composition. This is where the painting ended up. And a funny thing about this particular painting was that this building right here on the left, this door, this white door over here, is the side entrance for the kitchen of this new restaurant that just opened in Grafton. It's an Indian restaurant called BSG Lounge. I have yet to eat there, but man, did it smell good. So the whole time I was working on this painting, except for when this photo was taken, but most of both sessions, I was just getting these wafts of Indian food and spices, and it was both amazing and kind of torture to deal with that while I was working because it smelled so good. I love Indian food, and one of these nights Megan and I are going to go try the restaurant. Anyway, side note, this is where the painting ended up. One thing that I kept kind of struggling, this was the painting that I struggled with the most in all four of the works, and I'm really happy because it ended up selling during the show. This was the one that I was like, no one's going to buy this painting. And this just goes to show that as the artist, we have no clue what's going to resonate with collectors, buyers, judges, any of those parts of our audience. You just have to make the work and let everyone else decide what they want to make of it. And when they like it, it's sometimes you're like, that's exactly what I thought would happen because I also really like it. Sometimes they love a painting and you're like, I don't even love that painting that much, you know. But it's like, it again reminds us that art is subjective and there's something for everybody. That's what's so cool about making art, is that, you know, you can give yourself a lot of room to experiment and play, because if you're willing to trust the fact that, like, there's someone out there who's going to love whatever it is you're currently doing in your process and in your work. It can feel really scary, especially if you're like, a gallery doesn't like this thing I'm doing, or a collector doesn't like this new direction that I'm going in. You just have to trust that, like, they're going to find their entry into your current process. And thankfully that was kind of what happened with this particular painting. So the reason, I guess I can elaborate a little bit here and talk about the things that I felt like were working well, but things I'm kind of like, I don't know if I quite resolved this entirely. But this is the other benefit, I guess, of doing a plein air event, is that you have this hard deadline where you don't have weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks to toy and experiment and play with the painting. You just have to be like, okay, it's done, I got to turn it in, you know, and then whatever happens, happens. And that was definitely how I felt with this painting. I just was like, I don't know if I love the proportion of some of the shapes. My favorite interaction for sure is the right side of the painting. You can kind of see a little bit of, I mean, there's a little bit of glare, but you can kind of see where I was going into some of those subtle contrasts of what's in the shadow of the wall and the door. I really had fun putting in this bright, distant little street glowing light way back in the distance there. It's not super far back, but it's one of the farthest things in terms of the perspective. And then the texture on the wall, it's hard to see in this particular cell phone image. We'll see a better image here in a second, so I won't get into that too much. But it was mostly the proportion, the composition. I just was like, I don't know if I kind of like this sort of like repetition of the rectangle in the corner of a rectangle, from the purple to, you know, this blue one to this blue one to this white one. There's just a lot of like overlapping rectangles, which I like that part of the painting. I just don't know if they're in the right combination of places and proportions. Now, obviously, someone else can look at the painting and go, oh, it's perfect. You know, I love it how it is. Don't change any of those things that you just said, which is fine. You know, again, that's the point of art, is to learn what someone else sees and to appreciate their perspective of the work and how they interpret something. So, you know, I learned that sometimes it's better to just be like, okay, maybe this doesn't feel complete for this one painting, but I'm going to revisit this similar idea or concept in another work, and then maybe I'll feel like I learned a different thing in that painting, right? So it all becomes like this stream of exploration and experimentation where our process can continuously sort of go up and down, you know, and it's like sometimes you know exactly what you're trying to do, and you go in the studio or you go in plein air and you hit it out of the park, and you're like, that's like, I nailed my job today. I killed it at my job today. And then there's a lot of days, most days, where you're like, I don't know if I did a good job today, you know. And that was kind of how I felt about this painting. So I feel like every plein air show I've done, there's at least one. Sometimes there's like 3 or 4 paintings that I kind of feel the same, like on the fence about it. And sometimes it works out. You know, people still like those paintings. So I just wanted to do one slide per painting with a nice quality photo with my DSLR camera. I snapped these photos of our our paintings before we turn them in, mine and Nathan's. And that's another thing that I really try to not forget about when I'm at a plein air event. It's like, get good photos just in case, best case scenario, it gets collected and then you don't bring it home. Sometimes you make a painting and you're like, oh, I really love that painting. I wish I could still see it and learn from it, learn what I, just revisit what I liked about it. But if you have a really good photo, that's like second best thing, So take the time, plan your schedule so you can photograph things before you turn them in. The other reason you might want to do it before you turn in your paintings is because if you're doing it at home, or if you're staying with a host, or if you're at a hotel or an Airbnb or whatever, you have more like freedom to control the lighting of the photograph then. And in a gallery, you're not allowed to like bring in a ladder and move the lights and perfectly light your painting and then take documentation. So you don't want to wait until it's in the gallery necessarily, unless they're going to be lit perfectly, which for a plein air event is rare. So I would do it before you turn in your paintings. So the first painting I finished was the iris one, and because it was painted, the wall was next to the pizza place, I kind of thought, oh, maybe there's a pizza pun for the title. So I titled it Irises by the Slice. Good joke, not my best joke, but I also like that the painting kind of gives you this idea of slicing the composition in these strips. So it kind of works in two different ways that I felt was appropriate. This one was a cherry frame. The painting itself is 8x10, but with the frame and the gap, it's an extra inch, so it's an 11x9 object. And then my price for the painting was $720, and I was very, very thankful and grateful that one of the other artists in the event and volunteers, I believe she participated too, but for sure she was volunteering when she bought the painting. She's in the guild, and she's been following my work online for a few years, so she was hanging around and was like, all right, you know what, I'm gonna buy the painting. And that was on Friday that she purchased the painting, so that was really exciting to see too. This was like my second favorite painting from the week, was the iris one. And then I'm very excited to share, I kind of mentioned this when we started the presentation, it was sort of a spoiler alert. This painting received the Best of Show award this year from the event judges, who were Lori Beringer, Troy Tatlock, and Wendie Thompson. Lori and Troy I had met multiple times. We've done events together and become pretty good friends with both of them over the last couple of years. Wendie Thompson I've been friends with on Facebook for probably 4 or 5 years, just through mutual friends, but had never met her in person, so that was really nice to get to finally meet her. But I ended up titling this painting Window Shopping at Ritter's Soda. And it's kind of fun. If someone's looking at this painting, they're not familiar with the history of Cedarburg. Like, up until I made the painting, I didn't even know Ritter's Soda was ever a thing. That was just kind of a surprise. But it's kind of fun to have these really hyper-specific names or details in the title. For me, it's fun because I feel like it really grounds the painting in like a real life place and moment. And, this is kind of something I know a lot of other plein air painters talk about. And some artists will be like, I hate titling work because it's like you can only title something like Afternoon Light or, dusk warmth or dusk glow so many times, right? And it's like eventually I have to start thinking, well, what else can I come up with the title? And one of my favorite things when plein air painting is when a local person who has experience or history with whatever I'm painting comes out, sees me painting, is welcoming and generous enough to introduce themselves, and then they give me a little piece of history, and then I'll either put in my notes something that they said or part of the history, and then that'll inspire a title for a painting. That's kind of what happened here. But the label that's on the back side of the painting also kind of doubles that same idea. So normally, when I brought the painting in, I had my normal price, which was $1,600. And the unique thing about Cedarburg's plein air event is that the Best of Show award, which I have the little ribbon here from the event, which is really cool. Get to add that to my ribbon wall. Is that it's a purchase award, which means it's sponsored by a local business. It's not the art museum, but I think it's one of the banks in town. I think it's Port Washington State Bank, I think is the bank that sponsors the award. Um, but the art museum in Cedarburg is who collects or acquires the painting into their permanent collection. And I'm always really excited to have a painting get into a public collection, because it means that anyone who comes to Cedarburg, especially during the summer when they have these paintings on display, will get to see this painting. Otherwise, it's like, thank you, Mark, for the compliment. I appreciate that. Otherwise, if it goes to a private collector and you're not friends with that collector, you don't get to see those paintings, and it's kind of like, it's sort of bittersweet for everybody when that happens. But if it's in a museum collection, then it's like, hey, you just have to go visit the museum when it's on display or schedule a viewing, and you can go see the work. So it's really exciting. And I'm also super, super excited that this is the second painting of mine that's going into their collection through the plein air event, which I'll talk about here in a second. One other thing I wanted to share before I forget is that there is a little video that I took that you're seeing right now from the location of where I made the painting. I just wanted to give you a sense of like what the wall looked like, the other windows that were there. You can see my little reflection. I think I like wave in the video here if you look closely. I'm holding my phone. And just to give you a better sense of what it felt like to be there. And if you're in Cedarburg and you want to go see this window, as long as the building is still there, which hopefully it will be there for a long time, if you want to go see it, then you're going to have to just drive and meander around Cedarburg, because I don't remember the street names that this is located off of. I know that it's between the high school and Washington Avenue. So it's on that side of like the high school towards downtown, and it's a couple blocks away from the high school. I want to say it's the same street, I think, that Java House. No, wait, not Java House. There's another little like restaurant. I can't remember the name of it now. That's off of that same street, I believe. But there's not that many streets in downtown. If you're just driving around, it'll take you 10 minutes to find it otherwise. But that was a little video. I just wanted to give you a little bit of like what that area felt like. So anyway, we can keep on moving. I just want to make sure that that's not still playing, just in case. And then I mentioned a second ago, well, actually before I move on, let me just zoom in. This is my photo with my DSLR camera. So of all the images, this is probably one of the better ones that we're going to see in the slideshow today. The one thing about painting on gessoed panels is that you end up with these like semi-sunken in paintings. Now, if you're a painter, you know what that term means, but if you're not, sinking in is a term that we use to talk about the way that oil absorbs into your surface. And different primers, so acrylic gesso is a primer. There's traditional gesso, which is with chalk and rabbit skin glue. And then there are other like oil-based primers like oil grounds, which I mentioned earlier I like to use on most of my panels. But when things start to sink in, sometimes they lose that like shininess. Part of that is also the mediums that I like to work with. I don't use any resins, or I don't use a ton of like oil in my medium. I mean, my gel medium is linseed oil based, but it tends to dry with a fairly like matte or satin surface quality. So the image I have also is showing you the color properties with kind of like that matte reflective surface. But on the other side of that, then we also get to see like more of the pure color properties to some extent. So here's a quick little look at some of those details and just how soft and kind of like nuanced some of the edges were in the painting. Like the tree is just two colors basically, and a little bit of that orange showing through. This little like wheel sprocket looking thing was really fun to paint because it had these like multiple flat cylinder faces. So it's fun to like repeat this arc of reflected light. And then the shadow on the roll of tape was super fun. But yeah, if you want to see if you want to see your own kind of close-up view, you can find that image on my website right now in the plein air portfolio. And then I just mentioned briefly that it's the second painting to join the collection. There's a couple artists now who have had two. I think there's Tom Nachreiner, who has 3 paintings in their collection. But a couple people have 2 paintings in the collection, and so it's really fun to to have these two very different paintings of mine in their permanent collection. This is one that I made in 2022. It was a really big square pastoral scene with this farm equipment that was out, working on the field. I forget where this was located, but it's pretty far northwest of Cedarburg, kind of out in the countryside. This was the painting that, if you're familiar with my plein air zine books, there's a little story in one of them where I talk about my easel falling over because my dog was with me. The one and only time I brought Lenny, our dog, plein air painting with me, and my easel fell on him, and he ended up with phthalo blue all over his ears and his tail, and he had these little blue, hairs, patches of blue hair for like 3 months after that. So anyway, it's kind of a goofy, funny story, but now if you come to Cedarburg, like next summer, you'll see both of these paintings in the museum. They might even have the new one on display right now if you're in town. But all right, the next painting I finished up was the peony one. I ended up titling this one Our First Peony Lightly Roasted because it was the wall of the coffee roastery. I kind of liked it also because of the way that the light is hitting the flower. It feels like it's sort of roasting the color, roasting the flower. I also was roasted throughout the week, especially painting the wall. It was like 1 p.m. from like 12 to 3 that day, and I was just like super, super hot and uncomfortable, but these are things that we deal with and just put up with to make our work sometimes. And the last thing that I didn't show before that I put in, that I was like, I kind of feel like it might need a little bit of a border between the two spaces. This is the only painting where I did this. I was like, I think it needs more of a separation. So I put this very thin kind of purple line around the square of the peony. And I'm really happy that I took the time to kind of try that out and see if it would work, because it just made it feel a little bit more complete. Sometimes you make a painting that has these multiple views, and the focus ends up becoming about like the division between those two spaces, and then like, does it feel like they're complete or finished? That's sort of the problem in those paintings for me sometimes. So this was one where I'm like, I think it needs something to just say like, hey, this painting is finished. So it was fun to also sort of extend the idea of color theory and like color relativity, and pick a hue that would sort of marry those two parts of the painting in a way that felt satisfying. Oop, missed my desk there. But I liked this sort of like violet hue because it was sort of between, those ends of the color wheel of red and green, or red and salmon red, or red and green in that way. So anyway, that's where this painting ended up. As of right now, this painting is available. I did receive a message from a collector recently that might be interested in buying it. So who knows if it'll be available and for how long. But it's the only painting that I got back from the exhibition. So that was another big surprise. I don't always know what's going to happen in terms of sales, but to be fair, I'm aware of the fact of like, flowers are fairly universal subjects. You can make a flower for a plein air event and then put it into other shows, and it doesn't feel super hyper localized, even though it was made in that place. It's kind of fun to occasionally find subject matter where it's like, you know what, if this doesn't sell here, maybe it would fit another show down the road. And I mentioned before, there's this calendar event that I have in the fall for a 2-person show. And I went into Paint Cedarburg thinking maybe I'll have these paintings at the end of the week. Who knows if they'll sell or not. But if I do, it'd be nice to show them with this other exhibition. So anyway, the fourth and final painting that I made this week was called Last Light on Wisconsin Avenue. Took a while to come up with that title. This is one that seems a bit more conventional in terms of titling, but I could have maybe, now for the first time I'm thinking maybe there's something with like an Indian dish or food or spice I could have titled this that could have been interesting. But yeah, that was sort of a missed opportunity there. But this one is 14 by 11 inches. It was priced at $1,400, and it did sell to a couple who already has, I think, 2 of my paintings. So now they've added a 3rd painting of mine to their collection. I'm very honored and excited about that. They also purchased a painting from a friend of mine, the local artist Tom Kubala, incredibly talented watercolor artist and retired architect. Really nice guy, just all around great member of the Cedarburg artist community. And it's an honor that they were walking around with one of my paintings and one of his paintings. So I really admire his work a lot. But let's zoom in one more time on this painting so you can see the DSLR quality of surface texture here. Hopefully you can get a better sense of like the amount of paint that I was using, especially on the white glowing like yellow wall. This is a pretty thick impasto area of paint. Again, kind of like a dry brush, like gentle laying down of paint on the surface by this point in the process. And just how much geometry this painting has with the way I'm describing windows and the tree, different planes of the architecture. And then this was my favorite part of the whole process, I would say, is like trying to just inch my way through these nuanced contrasts of light that's sort of glowing just below the shadow line. That was really, really fun. And as I've been saying with my mediums, like my paintings are fairly dry. They look very dry, almost like like an oil pastel painting or drawing. It's just mostly pigment that we're looking at on the surface. There's not a whole lot of like reflective, shiny, oily medium in the paint, which sometimes I'm remiss about. I'm like, I kind of wish I had that. Most of the time, it's fun to work with very dry, paint consistency. Where was I going with that? So, because of the surface quality, then it's like really satisfying to get these textured dry brush patches of color in different shapes and areas of the composition. Kind of like up here, you can sort of see this faint lighter blue color just to help emphasize the edge of this corner, because these two blues are very similar. Before I added this little extra lighter passage, this edge of the rectangle almost got lost in the rest of the sky. And I was worried, I'm like, is it going to look sort of accidental, like this weird line? And for the sake of the composition, as I was playing with those shapes and the geometry of the composition, I kind of was getting flashbacks of Cubist paintings of people like, it was reminding me of artists like some of Picasso or Braque's Cubist work. Or there's the Spanish guy, Juan Miro, I think is who I'm thinking of too, where they're just playing with like flat geometric, planes of an object. I mean, this is negative sky space that I'm carving and playing with most of the time, but still it's fun to think about ways to divide up the picture plane. So that was kind of a fun new direction with that painting. And then Thursday, so I took all these photos, and then Nathan and I drove separately, but we went to drop off our work over at the art museum. And then after we dropped off the work, we walked down to the we dropped things off at the cultural center. Then we walked to the Cedarburg Art Museum, and he hadn't seen the show that was up in the museum yet. So we checked that out. We saw the past winning paintings. This is all Thursday, like prior to the awards and everything that was on Friday. So at this point, the artists were very exhausted, but most of us, I think, are at this point very what's the word I'm trying to think of? We just feel, I'm just totally drawing a blank on what I was going to say. Satisfied, I guess, something along those lines of just feeling accomplished and satisfied and wow, we just put all of this work and effort into our paintings, and now they're in the hands of the cultural center, and they will then be viewed by the judges who pick the award winners and all that stuff. So it's the first time the paintings move from our possession to someone else's possession, and that can come with mixed emotions, I think, for a lot of artists. But most of the time it's exciting because you're I can't wait to hear what people think about the work. I'm excited to talk to people and hear their reactions and just see what sticks and what doesn't stick and all that kind of stuff, and see everyone else's work, right? Because it's you don't really get to see what everyone else has been working on until the next day on Friday. So a little bit in passing as you're dropping off your work, but they're glimpses of those paintings. So we checked out the museum, and then we walked over to the Cedar Creek Park, and I had my painting gear with me, and I was like, hey, if you want to just paint for a while, you can borrow some of my painting gear. And I have this little paint box called the Petite Paint Box. It's made by Kelly Micka. She's an artist out in Philadelphia. Actually, she's in New York right now, but she has this new company. Check them out if you're looking for a very travel-friendly little palette box for painting. And I let Nathan borrow that. He made a little like 6x6 painting of the creek, part of the creek, really nice painting. And I was like setting up my stuff, and I'm looking at him from this like profile side view. I'm like, could be kind of fun to do a portrait right now. And I was like, would you mind if I did a portrait of you? And it was just the two of us, so it's kind of awkward to like have one of the two people just like staring at the other artist. But Nathan has been painted before, and he was cool with it. So it was a really fun little portrait to make. Probably one of my favorite portraits that I've made over the last few months. I've been doing a lot of, not a lot, but monthly portraits in Cedarburg, so it's kind of saying something to be like, this is one of my favorites recently. But it's a little 6x4 painting on this little oil primed home handmade little linen panel. And it was fun to work at this scale because, you know, his head is about 1.5 inches tall. So it's really hard to get detail, and you're focused more on like big plane shifts and like the texture of the beard and the curls of the hair. It was really fun to try to capture the sunburn on his neck. That was probably my favorite little detail of the portrait. And his beard also. He has a really nice beard to paint, especially from like a profile view. But I was joking as I was working on the painting, and like once most of his portrait was roughed in, I was like, you kind of look like a little impressionist painter because of the hat. A little like beret kind of hat that he's wearing. And with his beard too. I feel like you look at Monet and some of like Pissarro and that group of painters, and a lot of them have like these nice beards. So I'm like, it kind of feels timely to me a little bit. But it was a fun little painting to make. I gave it to Nathan. I was like, if you want it, you can have it. If not, I'm gonna happily keep this portrait. I really like this little portrait. But he's like, he thought about it for me. He's like, okay, I'll take it, which is cool. But this is my palette of color from the portrait of working on Nathan's painting here. And again, I think sometimes it's just kind of fun to see the painting and then see the palette and go, wow, okay, yeah, look at how either like extreme the color relationships and contrasts are, or how narrow and compressed value and chroma and hue are from like pile to pile. And this is pretty typical of how I paint. You know, I think this is common. Most artists work this way, where you're kind of working in these like little peripheral pools of color mixtures. And the benefit of working that way is you're seeing your color side by side with another color that you probably can find in your painting. What happens if we separate colors too far away on a palette is it's harder to compare the two, right? But if they're side by side, it's really quick and easy to see like how bright or dark or warm or cool or chromatic or less chromatic one of the two is compared to the other, or others if there's multiple little piles. The other benefit of working this way is that you're constantly pulling and dragging past pigment from the painting. So you're keeping this like physical unity throughout your painting process then, because you're using the same kind of green that you had for something before, or you're using that green to tone down the flesh tone and vice versa. And you know, so it's a really healthy way of creating harmony in your colors on your palette. So I would also recommend doing that too. And then I've got a slide here from the reception. There's two, actually. This is the first one. So this is what my 4 paintings looked like on the wall together. Let me zoom out just a hair. You know, I was pretty happy with how they looked, especially these 3, like I said before. This is kind of my oddball painting, you know, which is probably why I was so like, I don't think this is finished, because I think I was viewing it through the context of this other format of like a painting centered inside of a larger canvas. So this one just felt like the little red-headed stepchild painting of the week. But thankfully, again, it resonated with some collectors and it all worked out. The other thing I wanted to remember to read during my presentation today was the comments that were left by the judges for the award. And, you know, during these events, when it's time to see the award ceremony, I can only speak for myself, but it's a very nerve-wracking experience. No matter how cool or collected I might appear, internally I'm always a little bit like just nervous, you know, because you're like, who knows what's going to happen, what, you know, blah 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 blah. And it gets a little bit easier for sure as you do more events, and if you're getting recognized, I think there's just a sense of like, well, I've already, you know, it's a weird competitive way to say it, but I feel like there's kind of this like feeling that you have to prove yourself, I think, as an artist when you're being judged, literally judged on your work. And as we start to become celebrated through different events, or like if those things happen, in my experience, it does seem to get a little bit
easier to just trust that, like, hey, I know what I'm doing and I like what I'm doing. And especially with where I was at with the work this week, I felt like this is really the kind of plein air work I wanted to make. And that's not always how I feel. I think sometimes I settle for like, well, this is what maybe is more expected, or this is more in line with the definition of what I think plein air is supposed to look like. But I kind of forgot all of that and just went, I'm just going to make these paintings because I really want to make these paintings. And then everything worked out, thankfully, in a really ideal way. But these are the comments from the judges. So it says, best of show, a museum quality plein air painting. It draws from different art movements to create something new. So it's nice. They're just like short and sweet descriptions from the judges. And I heard during the reception from the judges and from people that were volunteering and helping the judges during that time. And they also relayed some really kind comments on the work and just really, really generous feedback. And, I think that was sort of how that's why it felt so rewarding to just give this work to the center before the awards were read aloud, because I felt like I'm really proud of this work. I'm really proud of what I made and where I experimented. And this is the kind of work I think I would be making if it wasn't for the event, either way. So then to be recognized and rewarded with this big honor, it just felt like the community and the judges and people that were sharing comments were like, we love what you're doing. Keep doing this. I think as an artist, it's like, that's all we want to hear, is that people like what we like too. And in today's world, it's so easy to feel trapped by like social media and branding and like expectations and pressure that's external, right? And like on top of internal pressure, right? Because we all have standards and quality that we're trying to make and produce for to please ourselves, right? That's always part of the equation. But to have the audience and the external part of that be like, hey, we love this, keep doing it, was like indescribable. I think that was something that I did not expect at all. And when it got down to the last award, I'm thinking, well, maybe this year I didn't get an award. That's all right. I like the work I made. I'm really happy. And then they read my painting and I was like, holy moly, I cannot believe that this is the outcome. Because, I think all artists, whether we admit it or not, are aware of the idea of like when you submit something to a show and to be judged, I think it's kind of hard not to take into account what we think a judge is going to respond to. And again, that's something that we have zero control over as an artist. You still can't help but kind of wonder, like, maybe they'll like this, maybe they're not going to like this. Like, I think that was kind of how I was starting to feel throughout. I'm like, I don't know if any of this is going to connect with the judges, but you know what? Like, if it does, it does, and if not, I'm really happy with it. And so because of that outcome, it just was like, the rest of that day just was kind of a blur, because I was like just still kind of in shock that was the outcome. But so this was a painting that Megan took when she was there with her parents on Friday night during the reception. And this is the same image from the beginning of the presentation with Cedarburg director and curator. So then it was fun later on to just like snap a photo of people that were like really eyeing the painting and really like taking it in from a close distance. I think that was one of the cool things about having a small painting that got the award, is that they have this tradition where they pull out an easel, they put it on the main stage, and the painting sits alone, kind of highlighted as the best of show painting. And the first painting of mine from a couple years ago that got the award was really big, right? So it's like people can see it from farther away, but because this one is a lot smaller in comparison, it really drew everyone in. And then the paint that's really actually, the part that's actually painted is even smaller. It's like people had to really come in close. And it was really fun for me as the artist to sit and kind of creepily watch people react to the work. But also, I just wanted to take a moment here and thank everyone who put the event together, including the Artist Guild, the Cedarburg Artist Guild. That's who hosts the event. It's their main fundraiser. The Art Museum, who helps sponsor the event in multiple ways, and for acquiring the painting. I'm very excited about that and honored. Collectors that came in support of the show, thank you to those people. These are the collectors from this other painting over here. And judges for the event, because it takes a lot of time and effort and attention and energy to look at 500 paintings. This year we had 502 paintings in the show, and I cannot imagine being a judge having to
compare and really dissect and really digest all of those paintings in 5 hours of time, right? So to be recognized and to have my work taken seriously with the judges is something I definitely do not want to shy away from highlighting here. So thank you to the judges, all of the other sponsors that put on the event, because it takes a lot of different groups of people to make the week-long event possible. And then last but not least, all of the other artists. And I just want to say congratulations to the artists who participated in the event and in the show. It's always inspiring to be in such a big plein air event, because you're seeing so many different examples of plein air painting, all within the same county of subject matter, but executed and exhibited in such different ways. It's such a great, refreshing reminder of what's possible when we think about plein air painting as a process and as a practice, actually. So thank you to all the artists that were in the show, and especially to those of you who had great, kind words on the paintings that I made. And it was really an honor to be in the show with all of you. So thank you. And then to wrap up the presentation, there were a couple last slides I wanted to talk about that were not really Paint Cedarburg related, but were part of this past week. So Saturday, so the work gets turned in Thursday morning, and then it's judged by the award judges Thursday afternoon. And then I forgot to mention, but after Nathan and I made our paintings by the creek, we went and had lunch, and then kind of an early dinner, and then we went over to the artist soiree party at the Cedarburg Art Museum beer garden. So shameless little plug for the museum. If you're ever in Cedarburg in the summer, especially on Thursdays, they have live music at the beer garden behind the museum. You can park downtown, walk around, and then go grab a beer and listen to live music. It's a really fun atmosphere. So all of the artists are given free drink tickets for that and the reception. So that's a really, again, fun way to sort of celebrate a week of hard work and hard fought painting that we all just completed. Anyway, we're looking at fish. So a few months, actually, about a year ago, Megan and I had the idea to take her dad out on a charter boat, kind of as like a birthday, Father's Day gift type of idea. Any of us had ever been on a charter boat. Well, Megan and I hadn't been on a charter boat before. Her dad has done a couple down in Mexico and California, but this is on Lake Michigan. And we had scheduled a charter fishing excursion for last September, but then when it came around time to take our trip, the weather was really horrible and they had to cancel and postpone our reservation. So we moved it to June of this year, for the first weekend of June on Saturday, like the 4th or 6th or whatever it was. And we invited my brother and two of our really good friends, Nick and Tori, to come with us. So basically the weekend looked like this. Thursday, I dropped off my work, went to the soiree, hung out with Nathan, actually had our Magic the Gathering annual Thursday night dinner with our friend Katie and my brother. So Nathan hung out with us and played some Magic with us, which was super fun. Had a really fun evening. And then Friday morning, a couple of artists who were from out of town, my friend Jimmy Navarro and Katie, his partner, who's also an artist, they're from Des Moines, Iowa. They reached out because they signed up for Cedarburg, had never been here before, and we're like, hey, when we're there, can we come see your studio, at the Arts Mill where I've been renting? And that was the plan, was to meet there on Friday morning at 10 a.m. But then I was like, I've got more work here at home in my basement studio that they might be more interested in. So I was like, hey, if you want to come to our house first, we can always check out the studio after. And so they both came over, and the artist David Becker came with them, and the artist Logan Hudson. David is from Illinois, and then Chicago area, I think. And then Logan is from Traverse City, Michigan, that area. All of them are very talented artists, really great, nice, funny people. So we had a really fun morning on Friday before we went to the art center to do the Artist Choice Award voting and all that kind of stuff. And then the rest of the day was the reception. So sorry, I'm kind of backtracking here, but that was Friday. And then Saturday morning at 4:30 a.m., I had to wake up with everybody else to drive over to Port Washington and do this charter boat. We had to be there by 5 a.m. So it was this insane, like, 4 or 5 day marathon of just painting, hanging out with artists, socializing, bringing some artists over to the house, giving them a tour of the studio, talking about painting. It was awesome. Having the show, boom, crazy, best of show award, like, just talked to, it felt like 1,000 people at the reception who were super nice, congratulating me and talking to me and stuff. And so I was like, my social battery was like 0 by the end of Friday. And then waking up at 4:30 after going to bed at like 12:30 was crazy. But we went out on the boat. We got really lucky with the weather. Again, I apologize. This has nothing to do with painting. But if you're ever in Port Washington, I highly recommend looking into this. It was really fun. The spring is typically better, I think, for salmon fishing and trout fishing. So we were there from 5 to 10, and we came home with 12 fish. Most of them, 11 of them, are coho salmon. That's all of these up on the top. And this one big one at the bottom was a rainbow trout that my father-in-law reeled in, which was really fun to see. So we had a really fun morning. I think all of us were kind of like half asleep, kind of loopy, but that made it all the more enjoyable. But the boat that we went out on was Nicky Boy. I don't remember, because there's more than one charter that's got the same name. I think his was just called Nicky Boy. There's no like number after it. All right, the next slide, second to last slide here, is about a work in progress drawing that I started a few weeks ago that I, on Sunday, went out and, or maybe this was on Monday. This might have been on Monday this past week, earlier this week. But it's of this view of a stump, this really big, I mean, it's got to be like 2.5 feet wide, or in, diameter, this big tree. It was an ash tree, apparently, which I found out, from the locals who live on the block, which it kind of feels perfect because we had a tree in our backyard where I grew up that was this big, beautiful tree. It was part of like the house, basically, right? You kind of get used to certain trees being part of your property and part of the landscape that you see every day when you come into the driveway and you leave or whatever. And the fact that this was also an ash tree just really makes it more personal for me because I grew up with a tree that also had to be taken down from the borer beetle that infested the tree. But I also just like this view of the backyard, these sort of shared property lines of these neighbors. And I've been working on this drawing twice now. And this is where it currently sits. And I'm using this kind of as a little promo image for a show that I've been hinting at throughout the presentation today, that's scheduled for October. There's a gallery that I'm in, Kim's Storage Gallery, where I did the other drawing during last week, who's hosting a 2-person exhibition with my plein air paintings and the work of Andy Paxos, who's an artist based out of Chicago who does a lot of plein air urban landscape paintings. If you've never looked up his work, please take some time to go check out his paintings. Here's his name here, Andy Paxos. But save the date if you're interested in coming to see our show and you want to celebrate with us during the reception for Friday, October 16th. It's during the Fall Milwaukee Gallery Night, which, if you're not familiar, is a quarterly citywide arts event, celebration, festival, you could say, where all of the galleries, most of all the galleries, studios, the museum, all have new exhibitions on display. That way, if you're from out of the area, you can come in for the weekend and see a lot of new artwork that just got put up on the walls. And so our show is going to correlate really nicely with that celebration. Our reception will be on Friday evening, I think starting at 5 o'clock. It's like 5 to 8 p.m. So I will be in the gallery, shaking hands, pressing the flesh, hanging out with people, and talking about the work and hanging out with Andy. It'll be a really fun evening. Hopefully we have nice weather for that. Please join us. Save the date. If you're not already subscribed to my newsletter, that's a great way to get reminded. Otherwise, go on your phone right now if you're not using it, and just add this to your calendar if you do not want to miss it. But this drawing is one that I will be planning to show and have available in the gallery. And while I've been working on this, the neighbors that live on the street,
Obviously you can tell I ramble and I get on these tangents and I have no script, which for better or for worse, you can decide if that's good or bad. But this drawing, I will tell you one quick story. I've worked on it twice. Both times I've worked on it, I've interacted with the locals who live on this street. And this red house is an old farmhouse that was built, I want to guess, like late 1800s, early 1900s. It's been there for a long time. The building, it's not in the photo, but the house to the left of that one is even older. It was the first house built in this entire neighborhood. And it's an old stone house that was built before the railroad was in Grafton. And really cool house, fully restored, beautiful house. The red one, though, is a house where I met the woman who lives there now and her sister who lives kitty corner across the street. They grew up in this house, and their whole childhood was spent in this house. They went to the high school, and so when I set up my paper and I was drawing, the woman who lives in the house came out and was like, "What are you doing? Are you drawing something?" And she saw I was focusing on the stump. And then that's when she told me about the borer beetle and the ash tree, this beautiful tree that was there when she was a little kid. And, that she said that was like, I don't know, 50 years ago or something. And that, when the tree was taken down, she was so sad, right? Because it was this part of the home. It was part of the neighborhood. And think about how big of a shadow this tree would cast, right? Just looking at the trunk. And it just felt like you could see her like revisiting these memories in her head as she was telling me these stories. And so obviously she's very personally connected to this tree stump. I also know recently I met through the portrait sessions in Cedarburg, the gentleman who lives in this house. He was our model a couple months ago. So it's just weird how connected the community is becoming all through plein air painting and drawing. That's one of the coolest things about doing this kind of work, is that you have this immediate visible introduction into the people that also share the same neighborhood as you. So she, I know, is kind of interested in the drawing. We'll see what happens there. But unfortunately, she's going to be out of town during the reception, so she won't be able to come and talk about the drawing and stuff. That would be really cool if she was available to come and share some stories just with whoever is interested. But the idea here is to really get this like historic drawing where there's layers and layers and layers of lines all made with graphite. Just really studying carefully, closely, looking at the subject and trying to convey, again, that sense of specificity, kind of like the irises and the peony flower paintings I made last week. So I'm happy with how it's going so far. This is where it currently stands. I'm just now getting into the actual trunk of the tree. And there's a lot of negative space with grass in the foreground and on the sides here. But yeah, it's been really fun just to go back to drawing. I used to do a lot of drawing when I was in school, and I totally believe it's like the foundation of all art, not even just 2D art. It's the fastest way to get the idea out of your head onto physical materials. So it's just been a really fun medium to be working with. And it's a pretty decent size drawing. It's 30 inches wide by 20 inches tall. It's on a piece of Strathmore riverfront paper, or River Point paper. It's technically a printmaking paper, but I've used it for years as a drawing paper and for gouache painting. Okay, we are finally at the end of the presentation. Let me just adjust the PDF here so you can see what I'm seeing. So today is Wednesday, June 10th, the day of the recording. And in 2 days, this Friday on the 12th, I will be one of 6 artists participating in this invitational exhibition / live painting event at Richardson School of Art and Gallery in Kimberly, Wisconsin. So my friend Nathan, who stayed with us, who was the subject of my little portrait, is one of the 6 artists. This is one of his paintings here. And he, along with being a professional artist, also works for Richardson kind of as their main, their main, I don't know if he's like the operations manager, director. He does everything from the classes that they offer. He a lot of times is curating the exhibitions that go up. He's also doing a lot with the storefront that's there. If you're in Wisconsin or Minnesota, Michigan, Illinois, in the Midwest, it's worth a stop. If you're ever near Appleton area
or like Fond du Lac, Kimberly, Appleton, Green Bay, that part of the state, take a trip over to Richardson because they have an insanely impressive painting collection that is always on display. They have this giant warehouse where the school and the studio and the galleries are located. And it's this giant loop that you make with, there's got to be like 500 plus paintings in their collection. It's a gorgeous collection of representational painting primarily. And along with the collection, you can also buy a lot of art supplies that they either are carrying or that they produce on location. They're one of the few art companies that actually make a lot of their materials in-house on location, especially things like their easels. This is my studio easel is one of their best easels. That's the brand is called Best. And so it's worth taking a stop to come and see their facilities. But if you're in the area, I know this is very short notice. It would be awesome to come and see you at this event. I just want to go up a little bit so you can see Kathy Wheeler's painting here. She's one of the 6 artists. She's a very, very, very talented figurative painter. But the other artists that are invited are Marianne Rice, Kathy Wheeler, who I was just talking about, Michael Reif, Nathan Brandner, my friend, and Robert Goins. The 6 of us will be participating in portrait painting, all looking at the same model that Nathan has scheduled for us. And we're going to be painting live from 10 to 1 on Friday. And then in the late afternoon, I think at 5:30 is the reception. So along with the paintings that we're going to be making fresh that morning, there are 3 to 5 paintings per artist that we've also delivered to the school, the galleries, that are on display from now until August 7th. But if you're around and available and you want to join us on Friday, it would be really fun to see you there. It's always fun to paint with other artists in person, kind of in like a quick paint format. But I'm really looking forward to it. I have a 9x12 panel and frame all ready to go. Should be a really fun time. That is going to conclude this presentation. It definitely ran longer than I was expecting, but to be fair, there was a whole week of experiences that just wrapped up. So I think it's okay that it took a few hours. But huge thank you to anyone who was here for the full duration of this live stream presentation. And for anyone who decides to watch this as a recording, I really appreciate your time. And I hope that you learned something new about my process. I hope you enjoyed seeing things kind of up close and with my commentary on the work and the process. But stay tuned for future videos here on my YouTube channel. It's been really fun to do these live streams because they're really easy for me to do, and definitely more feasible than trying to make an edited 2-hour video. So if you're not already familiar with my website, please check that out. It is acunaarts.com, acunaarts.com. I'll make sure that it's in the description of the video. If you also want to follow me on Instagram, my account is at Hector Acuna, art, A-R-T. And yeah, I think that's kind of it for the plugs. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Happy painting if you are a fellow artist. And again, I really appreciate the support and time and just an all-around opportunity to get to talk and share more in-depth look at things that are going on conceptually in terms of process and material. It's always really fun to talk about that stuff, so I hope it's as fun for you to listen in and watch along. So that's it for today. Take care, and I will see you in a future video. Happy painting, everyone. See ya. Take care.